Much to the surprise of a whole lot of people, Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee are really good. Much better than most veteran fans of the series would have expected it to be, considering all of the controversial changes it said it was going to make. That's because most of these changes land really well. But while that is true, not everything Let's Go does is executed well, or well enough at any rate. And the unavoidable fact of the matter remains that there's some things in the game that hardcore fans of the series aren't too pleased about, all things considered. In this feature, we're going to talk about 15 such things, so let's get right into it. Too easy. It seems like for the past decade or so, Pokemon has been getting easier and easier with each new entry in the series, and keeping up with that trend, it's never been as easy as it is in Let's Go. Sure, Nintendo and Game Freak both made it clear that this was a game tailor-made primarily for even younger audiences, with accessibility being of the utmost importance, and owing to that, the game's been made significantly easier. So easy, in fact, that throughout the main course of the campaign, it doesn't present any sort of challenge at all. To be fair, post-game battles against Master Trainers and a few other challenges that are best left unmentioned to avoid spoilers do present significantly challenging fights, but the actual main game itself is disappointingly easy. Changed Eevee training. Eevee training was one of the things in Pokemon Let's Go that were changed quite dramatically from what fans of the series might be used to. Rather than increasing your Pokemon's effort values by picking out specific kinds of Pokemon depending on which stat boost defeating them would result in, the game toned it down quite a bit, instead making it all about candies. It's not like there's no Eevee training whatsoever, and for those who want to get into specialized training for the team can still do so, but it's still notably watered down from past games. It's a shame because coupled with the fact that you can now see all of the Pokemon in the overworld and hence choose which ones you want to fight against rather than being at the whims of random encounters, proper Eevee training could have worked really well. No breeding. Breeding is something else that most hardcore of Pokemon fans often spent a lot of time with. It's a mechanic that one can easily ignore, but once you get into it, you can easily get lost in it. It had incredible depth, could affect everything from the gender to the nature to the abilities of your Pokemon, and allowed players to get basically the exact kind of Pokemon that they were looking for. This is not included in Let's Go as part of the game's bid to simplify things. As mentioned, it's not something that particularly affects the main game, but breeding was something that came into play quite a lot in things such as post-game and competitive play, and it's disappointing that it's not included here. Weird online functionality. Speaking of competitive play, online in Pokemon Let's Go is weird, and not in a good way. To battle against other trainers, you must go through a bizarre process of selecting picture-based passwords, which you then have to share with other players. Of course, there's also the caveat that now, with Nintendo Switch Online being a thing, you can't do online battles and trading unless you've paid for the service, which also restricts things a little. No wild battles. This was the big change in Pokemon Let's Go that had a ton of veteran series fans up in arms. In the latest Pokemon titles, battles against wild Pokemon are no longer a thing, and are instead presented as a Pokeball throwing minigame, in the vein of Pokemon Go, though battles against legendaries and against Snorlax are actual proper battles. There is an argument to be made here that the absence of Pokemon battles actually makes a nice change of pace, and keeps things from getting dull, but regardless, millions of series fans are displeased about this change. Free starters. Given that "gotta catch 'em all" has been a sentence that has been associated with Pokemon for as long as Pokemon has existed, you'd expect the game would actually want us to, catch them. But throughout the game, the original 3 starters, namely Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle, are literally handed out to you. Given that they're starters, these Pokemon are also particularly rare, so the fact that they're just handed to you feels all the more jarring. That said, it should be noted that this was something that Pokemon Yellow did as well, so this isn't the first time something like this has happened. No growth for the series. One of the criticisms that is leveled at Pokemon most often is that the series refuses to grow. The argument goes that from the very first games on the Game Boy to now, even if one puts all of the changes together, there just hasn't been too much growth. The fundamentals remain the same. Of course, the counter-argument is that if it's not broke, why fix it? Regardless, given that Let's Go was the series' very first proper mainline outing on a console, some fans were hoping to see at least some changes that would indicate the direction the series would take with the next year's full-fledged sequels. These are, of course, remakes, and by their very nature meant to be a simplified form of a Pokemon RPG, so seeing anything radical was probably always out of the question. But fans of the series had still voiced their displeasure over the fact that there just hadn't been any real steps forward with Let's Go. Forced motion controls. Forced motion controls are almost never a good thing, but Pokemon Let's Go surprisingly makes them work well enough. The controls for throwing Pokeballs aren't super accurate, but they're still decent, and can actually be kind of fun. What's not fun is that they're the only way for you to play if you play in console mode. Why not give players the option to switch them off? Using motion controls for throwing Pokeballs at Pokemon is admittedly cool, but for many it can wear off pretty quickly. The fact that turning it off isn't an option hasn't gone down well with some people, which brings us to our next point. Restrictive control options. The inability to turn off motion controls is emblematic of how Pokemon forces very restrictive controls on players. Just as motion controls are necessary to play in console mode, handheld mode requires players to use gyroscopic controls for aiming and throwing Pokeballs. A simple option of maybe aiming with the analog stick and then throwing with the Pokeball with a press of a button should have been an obvious inclusion. Right now, it's a baffling omission. For players with motor disabilities, it's flat out game-breaking. No Pro Controller support. Yet another example of restrictive control options. The Pro Controller is one of the best controllers ever made and is definitely the best controller Nintendo has ever produced, and as such, the preferred way of playing games for a lot of people. And yet, it's not supported in Pokemon Let's Go at all, which is a little baffling because the Pro Controller does have gyro controls built in it, so it could have easily been used for the compulsory motion controls in the manner that they're done when the game is played undocked. No cloud saves. Cloud saves are one of the features that Nintendo Switch Online has brought with it, and it's something that is undoubtedly quite useful. The fear of losing your saves and your progress is always lurking in the background, so having the safety net of cloud saves is a huge deal. In Let's Go, however, cloud saves are disabled. To be honest, it kind of at least sort of makes sense. Pokemon games have traditionally only allowed one save slot so that players can't cheat their way to a full Pokedex, and in effect, that is what having no cloud saves does as well. Still, if you somehow lose your Switch or the data on your Switch, your Let's Go save is gone as well. No Pokemon Bank functionality. Pokemon Bank was an incredibly useful 3DS app that Game Freak made a while back that essentially allowed players to collect and collate all of their Pokemon across various Pokemon games in the app. So if, for instance, you had Pokemon from X and Y and Sun and Moon in your bank and started playing Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, you could transfer all of the Pokemon in your bank over to them. Additionally, if you had a ton of Pokemon in your decks in any save, but wanted to start a new save in that game, you could always send your Pokemon to the bank and then restart the game without worrying about losing your Pokemon. Pokemon Bank functionality is not enabled in Let's Go, which is at least somewhat understandable since it is, after all, a 3DS app. No more Safari Zone. Remember the Safari Zone in Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow? Well, of course you do. Regardless of whether or not you liked the bits that required you to go into particular areas of the zone to progress further, it was a very cool location thanks to the fact that it held a lot of excellent and rare Pokemon, and was a good spot for filling out your Pokedex. Well, it's gone in Let's Go, which is just shocking to be honest, and replaced by the fairly useless, depending on how much you've invested in Pokemon Go Park. It's a little hard to swallow because the original Safari Zone was a place where you couldn't battle Pokemon and could only throw Pokeballs and other things at them in an attempt to catch them, which would have been perfectly in line with how Let's Go handles wild battles. The Safari Zone's exclusion in Let's Go, as such, is beyond inexplicable. Unnecessary dialogue changes from the originals. For some reason, there's a few lines from the original Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow releases that has been rewritten and changed for Let's Go. Of course, this isn't uncommon to see in remakes. Rewrites happen a lot in remakes and can often lead to improvements, and the original Game Boy titles were full of lines that needed desperate improvements. However, there were also a few really cool lines that Let's Go has changed entirely. For instance, in the original games, Lieutenant Surge talks about having fought in the war, which has led to fans theorizing about what this war could have been, and what implications this has on the series' lore. In Let's Go, any such mention of a war has been removed entirely. Mew availability. Mew was a Pokemon that you couldn't actually obtain within the game back when Pokemon Red and Blue launched, and that's true in Let's Go as well. Mew is only obtainable through the Pokeball Plus. If you buy it, you get it for free. If you don't, you cannot get a Mew. That said, at least you no longer have to travel to giveaway events to get a Mew like in the old days, so it's not all bad. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.